and Photographs of the Civil Rights Movement, 1960 to 1970. We're joined tonight by Dr. Lyneise Williams. My name is Talia. I'm the events manager here at Flyleaf. And before we begin, I just want to give y'all a quick reminder to check out our full events calendar. We have a ton of everything this season. We have nonfiction about topics ranging from Black history to food and gardening. And then we have novels ranging from romance to literary fiction to domestic thriller. And you can watch all of our past events back. So I do encourage you to check out the Flyleaf Crowdcast page. You can see all the upcoming events and all the past events as well. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and our guests, you can order I Am a Man from Flyleaf by clicking the button just below our faces. Thanks to Dr. Ferris, we now have signed book plates. So anybody who orders a book will get a book plate with their copy. And we are open for browsing Monday through Saturday from 11 to 5. So you're welcome to either order online by clicking the button below our faces, or you can come in and shop with us in person. Okay, without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. William Ferries was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1942. As he grew up on a working farm, Ferris began to document the artwork, music, and lives of the people on the farm and in his local community. The archive of recordings that he created and the documentary films that he had a hand in producing have served as powerful tools in institutions of higher learning for decades. Recently, his box set, Voices of Mississippi, won Grammy Awards for Best Historical Album and Best Album Notes. And Lyneise Williams is Associate Professor of Art History at UNC Chapel Hill. She's the author of Latin Blackness and Parisian Visual Culture, 1852 to 1932. Williams is the founder and director of VERA, Visual Electronic Representations in the Archive Collaborative, and an interdisciplinary center advocating for culturally responsible archival practices that address the significant erasures in visual, material, and historical representation disproportionately affecting communities of color. Dr. Williams has presented this work at the Library of Congress, the National Park Service, the British Library, the National Archives, and much more. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to our guest tonight. I'm going to take away my audio and video to keep the focus on our guests, but all throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Ask a Question feature. And at the end of the event, I'll come back up to read out questions to our guests and to wrap up the event. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Bill, would you like to start with your comments?
Well, I would first like to thank Flyleaf and the amazing staff who are doing such a great job. Independent bookstores are the heart of our communities in this nation, and Chapel Hill is blessed to have Flyleaf. I also want to acknowledge as we begin this, a dear friend of Lyneise and mine, Robert Ferris Thompson, the distinguished historian of African and African American art at Yale, with whom Lyneise did her PhD in art history, and I was honored to teach in the 70s. Bob, we love you and are thinking of you. I also want to acknowledge the people who made this book possible. It accompanied an exhibition that was created at the initiative of my old friend Gilles Morat, who directs the Pavillon Populaire, a beautiful historic museum devoted to photography. And we literally filled that museum with photographs. And at the opening in 2018, over 50 people came from America to join the opening ceremonies. And those ceremonies included an amazing symposium on Black photography. And Lyneise Williams was one of the stars who came from the University of North Carolina. She was joined by William Sturkey, by Jenna Ray McNeil, by Mary D. Williams, and that was the launching of the idea and the production of the exhibit and the book. Recently, that book has been translated and reprinted by the University Press of Mississippi. Greg Gill, the director. The exhibit just opened at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum under the directorship of Pamela Jr. and Katie Blunt. And the exhibit will travel for the next 5 years through the leadership of Kathy Dowell and the Mid-America Arts Alliance. There was a team, an amazing team of students and colleagues who gathered these photographs that included Matthew LaBarbera and Michaela O'Brien, who were my assistants, along with Greer Underwood and Mary D. Williams. They worked closely with me to identify and select the photographs. We worked with teams at UNC and Wilson Library. Maria Estorino, the director, oversaw the selection of photographs that was done with our colleague Steve Weiss, Aaron Smithers, Brian Gimza, Stephen Fletcher, and Aaron Smithers. And Lonnie Bunch wrote the foreword to the book. So it's been a family affair, a team affair, and I cannot say what an honor it is to be on this program tonight with you, Lyneise. Your brilliant scholarship, your eloquent voice in unveiling for us the history of Black photography is an inspiration, and I'm so grateful that you took time to be with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Bill. This is truly an honor, absolutely an honor to be able to be in conversation with you about these works. I also want to thank Flyleaf for the opportunity to do this, but I've been looking at these images for years and years and years. And so going to the exhibition in Montpellier was a wonderful opportunity to actually see the photographs themselves, but we'll talk about the details of that shortly. So, you mentioned you were born in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and one of the many cities whose history included enslaved Africans as the labor for cotton plantations, African American sharecroppers, and Jim Crow racial segregation laws. Lynchings were common in Mississippi in the first half of the 20th century, only to be replaced by other forms of racial violence after that. Your extensive life's work of books, films, and recordings focus on African American culture and folklore. You have elevated it and by placing it in important cultural spaces like the Smithsonian Institution, Mississippi's Center for Southern Folklore, and UNC's Chapel Hill's Center for the Study of the American South. In order to do this work, you had to pay close attention to what people were doing. You had to be open to recognize the value of African American culture and gain people's trust that you'd protect it and take care of it. That wasn't a common position for white men in the 1960s and 70s, as you know. You've been amplifying and centering African American voices and culture rather than yourself. I see this as a practice of a belief that today would be called Black Lives Matter. Can you talk about how you arrived at this understanding and practice, and tell us about your journey in sustaining that practice?
Well, my understanding of Black Lives Matter began before I knew those words on the farm where I grew up, where my first friends were Black children who also lived there. I sometimes attended Rose Hill Church, a Black church on the farm that held its services on the first Sunday of each month. And my parents taught us, I and my 4 siblings were taught daily to value and respect every person's humanity. And I've simply tried to help record and preserve the canon of Black voices. Black Lives Matter and Black Voices Matter. And I realized early on in my visits in the church that these beautiful hymns were all sung from memory. None of them were written down in hymnals. And that when those families were no longer there, the music would disappear. And so that inspired a career as a folklorist to document the voices, the music, the stories, the quilts that express a powerful, fundamental part of what we think of as the American experience. And thankfully today, Black Lives Matter and leaders like Lonnie Bunch are framing our understanding, reframing our understanding of the American experience and who we are as Americans through the lens of Black Lives Matter.
Okay. Let's talk about the exhibition itself. The exhibition and the book is called I Am a Man, Photographs of the Civil Rights Movement, 1960 to 1970. So that's a single decade. You may not have been in Vicksburg between 1960 and 70, but can you tell us about your experiences with African Americans' efforts to gain full civil rights during that period, and why you chose that decade?
Well, the choice of the decade really was the choice of Gilles Morat, who came to me with the idea for the exhibit and asked if I would curate it. And I naively said, sure, I'd love to, not realizing how far and deep it would carry me in understanding these photographs. But the 60s was a very powerful decade for me. I began my study in college at Davidson College in 1960. And I ended that decade at Jackson State, just after the murders of 2 students, which Doris Derby, who is featured in this exhibit, photographed the memorial services for. And during that decade, the nation was changed in deep ways. I was changed. My family was changed. My father was a farmer, and he was a moderate white farmer. My mother was college educated. We were privileged whites who had education, but they told us in no uncertain terms that we had responsibilities because of that privilege. And I remember getting involved with SNCC. I spent a summer during my time at Davidson at Union Theological Seminary and worked there with 2 young women, Bobby Yancey and Mary King, who were part of SNCC. And that was the summer before Freedom Summer. And when all of the civil rights workers came to Mississippi with Robert Moses, and I told my parents that we wanted to meet with the SNCC workers in Vicksburg who had Freedom House there. And several of our friends who were in college and high school in Vicksburg wanted to join us. And my father said, well, I'm interested and I'd like to join you as well. So we went to the Black Catholic Church for an evening. And I'll never forget it. Robert Moses sat across the table and spoke to us about COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations that he headed. And my father listened carefully and asked questions. And at the end of the evening, he said to my father, he smiled, and he said, "This is the first time I've ever had a civil conversation with a white Mississippian." And this was a frightening time. That was a summer when 3 civil rights workers were murdered. And to me, my life was being carried in directions I could never have imagined. And my study of folklore was framed by that experience. I saw the recordings of voices, the photographs of faces, and the films of performances as a political act, because these were worlds that had never been recorded to my knowledge. Certainly the people with whom I worked were unknown on the printed page. And so civil rights was important. And then I remember going to a YMCA symposium at the University of Illinois when I was at Davidson, and singing "We Shall Overcome" in a circle with the SNCC Freedom Singers. And Bernice Reagan Johnson was standing beside me. We had arms around each other, and it felt like the ground was shaking, her powerful voice. I could feel. So these were moments that informed what I did. And when I went to Jackson State to begin my teaching in 1970, it was in the aftermath of the murders on campus, and we became part of what in Jackson in the civil rights community was called the stockade. You described yourself as behind the stockade because we knew everyone at Tougaloo College, at Jackson State. Alice Walker was beginning her career as a young novelist. Her husband, Mel Leventhal, was a civil rights lawyer. Her daughter, Rebecca, had just been born. Without knowing, it was the beginning of a different era in which I was moving from being a student to a teacher. And my neighbor and colleague at Jackson State was Margaret Walker Alexander, the novelist, poet. And today I'm on the board of the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State. The whole era of the 60s shaped and defined my life as a folklorist and teacher. I didn't have the courage to do what these photographs and photographers did, but I thought I will do my part. And my own work as a folklorist I've seen as a political act and as a kind of partnership with what these photographs describe. But this was not my idea to do this project. It came from France to Chapel Hill, and that brings us here tonight.
Okay, and you spoke about Doris Derby. I actually want to pull up some slides so that we can see some images. Let me find out how to do that now. Okay, at this point, I am going to ask Talia about the slides? Because I don't see where I
Yes.
can.
Sure. It should be
right here. Now I found it. Allow.
There you go. Okay, I'm gonna hop back out.
Okay. Great. Pause video. Let me get the images here. Okay. This isn't working, so maybe I can get you to bring the slides up.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you. And we're going
Why don't you go ahead and ask the question, and
Okay.
I'll pull it up.
Okay. My question is, Doris Derby, back to Doris. She's one of the featured photographers in the exhibition. And she said that she carried 3 cameras when she went out to do her work, one on each shoulder and one hanging in the front. This is a very distinct physical presence, and it's not the same as standing alongside a tense situation, recording an event with a smartphone, which is how we commonly do that today. Will you talk about these differences and how you and the featured photographers navigated your access to the settings where you work and access to publishing? I mean, could everybody get published? Could they get their work published? And did they have access to the various settings? Because you have a lot of different photographers in the show. There's Doris. On the left-hand side, you can see one camera here, and she's holding something in her hand. And then there's Bill with a film camera. So.
Well, I should say that I often carry, this is an Aeroflex BL. It's a 16 millimeter camera that's film. But a lot of my work was still photography, and a little like Doris, I often carried 2 cameras, one with black and white film and the other with color film. And a lot like Doris, I tried to immerse myself in homes, in intimate spaces with musicians, storytellers, and quilters with whom I worked. And photographers in this book often captured the violent confrontations that occurred during sit-ins and marches that received international attention. I was always aware of the danger I was in, given the racial codes of the time, but I also knew the white privilege my caste and class afforded me. I will never forget the kindness and support and protection of the Black community who invited me into their homes. And Doris also went for intimate situations like classrooms and medical offices to capture the backstory to the frontline sit-ins that were being photographed by others. And Doris and I first met when we were at Jackson State together, and she was a very prominent figure at Jackson State and in the whole community because of her photographs and her collection of African and Black art generally. And she's a very important part of this exhibition and of the book.
Excellent, excellent. And she has incredibly stunning images, and she was one of the few women who were photographing.
Yes, that's right.
And fortunately, she's included in the exhibition. Let's look at the next slide. I have another question around the images. Some of the images by photographers featured in the exhibition were published in media platforms like newspapers. Here are examples of Bob Edelman's images in the New York Times on the left side from September 29, 1963. We usually assume that photographic images like those featured in your exhibition are what people actually saw in newspapers, but they aren't. The difference is because the photograph is being printed using a different technology for newspapers than it is for the photographs that you have in the exhibition. So while they're both derived from a film negative taken with a single lens reflex camera, like what we saw Doris Derby carrying, pre-digital newspapers are printed using a variety of different technologies. And in that cases, the photomechanical reproduction, which is what the technology is called, it reduces the sharpness and clarity that's visible in the images. So this is the same photographer on the left-hand side, and a lot of the image is just blackened out. There are very few nuances in the faces. You can get a sense of what their bodies are doing, but if you look at the image on the right, which is the same photographer, you can see the details in skin tones and in facial expressions, and all of that is missing in the newspaper images. So we may think we've seen the image by seeing it in a newspaper, but the exhibition and the book give us a very different view of those same images because of the technology of seeing. So talk to us about your selection process. I mean, you did talk about it a little bit before, but what were your thoughts behind the choices of photographers and images? And were there images that you really wanted to include, but you found that you couldn't?
Yes. Well, basically, we wanted to collect images that spoke from the heart, that captured in a profound human way what this movement was all about. Not a newspaper account that gives a kind of factual overview. So when we went through the photographs, we looked for the human condition being revealed, the fear, the beauty, the courage of people who were part of this movement. And they were old and young, black and white, men and women. And what you, Lyneise, are pointing out in the differences between the photographs reproduced in the newspaper and those in the book is very important. Black Lives Matter has opened our eyes, has removed the veil of ignorance as to what racism does, and it even operates in photography. And the nature of black and white photography and its reproduction within the media often essentially reduce the face to hardly discernible features, whereas the reproduction of photographs as art, which we do in this book, shows every detail. With digital assistance, we can reveal faces in their true beauty, and that is part of what we are doing. And the book is moving this documentary journalistic body of work and giving it the platform of a great museum exhibit in which photographers like Doris Derby and Danny Lyon's work are justly recognized for their beauty as well as for documenting the moment in the photograph.
See, that's okay. As I look at this, and I think about the other images in the exhibition, the majority of the images feature events situated in what we commonly call public setting, public space. However, the presence of African Americans and other people of color in those spheres call the idea of public space into question. Geographer David Harvey argues that space generally called public is highly hierarchical and commercialized. Urban planner and architect Itziar Gonzalez Viros argues that the street is not a public space, but an administrative one, regulated and policed by municipal and state authorities. Recent protests against police violence, among many other protests in ostensibly public spaces, and even the incident between bird watchers Amy Cooper and Christopher Cooper suggests that so-called public space is segmented by lines of race, class, sex, sexuality, and disability, where white, primarily male, heterosexual, abled, and national body may circulate as a full-fledged citizen. All those who don't fit that description are constantly subjected to various forms of restriction, violence, exclusion, surveillance, ghettoization, and death. Aesthetic forms like monuments can be added to that list of barriers, since they inscribe a dominant cultural narrative in urban space through the sculptural reproduction of some bodies and not others, and bodies that enacted violence or were complicit in such act upon those who used the space and their ancestors. Talk to us about the ways the photographs in the exhibition speak to the notion of public space and how those spaces function in actuality.
Well, I think the whole foundation of the civil rights movement in the 60s deals with so-called public space, the desegregation of public schools, of public lunch counters. These are highly public spaces that were not public before the 60s. They were segregated. The right to vote, the right to eat, the right to study, where you choose, was defined by the color of your skin. And the protests at the end of the 60s that laid to rest the destruction of those barriers was what the 60s was headed for. And Black Lives Matter reminds us that that battle is still ongoing. The right to vote is still an issue in our nation today. So what we're looking at in these photographs is a moment in time in a long history, a great river of social and racial protest and change that began in slavery in this country and that continues today in Black Lives Matter. But these faces, Dr. King and all of those marching courageously with him, are a seminal, significant part of that history.
Yes, yes, they are. And I look at this and I think about, well, actually, it ties into my next question and the next image. So now I'm going to circle back to my first question. And your Black Lives Matter practice. So I'm asking my question in the backdrop, against the backdrop of these two images. On the left, the image is by photographer Spider Martin. It depicts Reverend Jose Williams, John Lewis, and other participants facing the police at a march in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And on the left is a photograph taken by photographer Jonathan Bachman at a protest against excessive force against Black residents in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in July 2016. Do the words Black Lives Matter and your practice mean what they did when you first began, or have they gained new meanings?
Well, frankly, the phrase Black Lives Matter was not a part of my world when I began. It was the 60s, and civil rights, social justice were the phrases, and Vietnam, I was a conscientious objector during the 60s. All those were part of my experience, and what Black Lives Matter has done is to give us a frame in which to look at our lives, Black and white, and to understand where we stand within this long history. And Lyneise, I'm so grateful to you for joining these two images, which remind us that there we are, then and now. These photographs are hauntingly similar, and they remind us that the struggle for civil rights and racial equity endures today. They also capture the power and beauty of young people who courageously confront power. Those images that we're looking at are timeless reminders of the long road of struggle behind us and also the road that lies ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. How much more time do we have? Should we go to questions? I mean, I have a bonus question, but
Sure. Why don't we
maybe
ask?
we can-
Let's see if there are any questions, and then
Yes.
if we have time, we can go back.
No problem.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please either write them in the chat or use the Ask a Question feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And I'm gonna close the screen share for right now. We can come back
Okay.
to it. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? I'm sure there are people who are typing furiously right now. It's a little more complicated than just raising your hand to ask a question at an event, but I appreciate everyone bearing with us. Do you want to go ahead and ask your bonus question now, and we
Sure.
can?
Okay, can we see the last image?
Sure. Yes. Hold on one
Take a
second.
look at that. Okay. In a 1964 position paper, SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their communication secretary wrote, quote, "It is no accident that SNCC workers have learned that if our story is to be told, we will have to write it and photograph it and disseminate it ourselves," end quote. Your exhibition, Bill, includes work by two SNCC photographers, Doris Derby and Danny Lyon. And you can see an image by Doris Derby on the left side and Danny Lyon's poster for SNCC on the right-hand side there. Can you talk about the role of photographic images and in the way the pursuit of civil rights coalesced and how the civil rights movement was consumed?
Absolutely. SNCC leaders recognized that gifted photographers like Danny Lyon and Doris Derby could capture both the violence unleashed by whites against protesters, and the courage of those protesters, black, white, old, young, men and women. And they featured their photographs on posters to galvanize support for their struggle. The photograph has long been associated with the struggle for black freedom. In the 19th century, Frederick Douglass argued that photographs dignified slaves and former slaves as fully realized human beings. In the 20th century, the photograph of Emmett Till's mangled face in his open coffin launched the civil rights movement. Till's mother, Mamie Till, asked that the casket be left open to, quote, let the world see what they did to my boy. This exhibition features photographs, and this book features photographs that are part of a long, rich tradition of photography and the struggle for black freedom. They are both a link to Frederick Douglass and the 19th century and to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter today.
I have a few audience questions that have come through. So I'd like to start with a question from Jeannie, who says, when we see so much similarity between the photos from then and now, where do you see hope for the future?
Well, I always see hope in young people. And in the 60s and now, young people are not afraid. They believe in ideas, and I've seen this in my students. I see it in the news, the vision, the hope for the future, because the future belongs to young people. We've lived our lives, if you're my age, but they are just starting, and they're connecting the dots of civil rights and race and the environment. The future of the very planet itself is connected to addressing civil rights and racial issues. And as a friend of mine, William Winter, once said, they asked him about civil rights. He said, we're halfway home and a long way to go. And the next generation will take us further down this road. And I have hope. I think the glass is half full. It's not half empty. We are fulfilling the dream of Dr. King that one day children, black and white, in my home state of Mississippi would play together and study together and live together in a common world, so that the work reflected on the pages of this book offered us hope in the 60s, and the work that we see underway today offers us hope in this century.
Charles asks, Bill, how did you manage documenting both a social movement like the civil rights movement and the traditional folk life found in the rural Southwest?
Well, really, I did the latter. My focus was on the lives of people with whom I would live and spend time. I didn't photograph the civil rights movement in the way that photographers in this book did. I admired them. Their photographs deeply touched me and were an inspiration for my own work. But my relationship to those photographs was not in any sense as deep and profound as, say, Doris Derby's and others. I have photographs that are part of the 60s of black and white hands shaking on the side in a mural, of interior shots of Reverend King and the Kennedys together on the walls of homes. But these photographs are courageous, taken in the midst of action that was life-threatening. I don't think I had the courage to do what the photographers in this book did, and this book is a salute to their work.
Allison asks, can you talk about some of the challenges you faced in your research in terms of selecting and identifying the images? How many of these images are currently available for research in public collections versus in public hands, previously published versus unpublished?
That's a great question. One of the points of the exhibit in the book was not only to recognize the celebrated photographers like Danny Lyon and Doris Derby, but to recognize unknown photographers who did coverage of civil rights events for local newspapers. So we scoured every state archive in the American South, the Library of Congress, and private collections like the collection of my friend Roland Freeman and Doris Derby. And one of the biggest repositories was right here at UNC in Wilson Library, Stephen Fletcher's massive multi-million collection of images, on many of which deal with civil rights. And many of the most powerful images came from collections like those here and in state archives that are not private and can be used simply for the price of reproduction. So much of this is, and some of the ones we would have liked to have included, we simply couldn't afford. But most of this collection is in public hands, and those are images that can be reproduced for anyone who would like to have them. I would also like to acknowledge the leadership of Melinda Maynor Lowry and the Center for Study of the American South, where I had an office for many years. Melinda has been a leader for civil rights throughout her career, and her career is only beginning. But she and her team there have done amazing work in making this book possible and in hosting the first American exhibit that was a smaller exhibit, but a very important exhibit at the center. So I want to say a shout out to you and to Terry Laurent and others there who've been so supportive of our work.
I have a question here from Adrian. Can you talk about the importance of music in the civil rights movement?
Music was at the heart of the civil rights movement, just as it is at the heart of the Black experience. And the anthem of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," was adapted from a Black hymn by Pete Seeger, who changed a few words to make it roll off the tongue better, as he said. But many singers, like gospel singers, blues singers, B.B. King, and many others. Mahalia Jackson was a close friend of Reverend King's. And before he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, she said on the phone, he would call her before he did events. And she said to him, "Martin, tell about your dream." And he said back to her, "Well, would you sing a few verses of gospel for me?" And she sang a few verses of Amazing Grace for him. but Harry Belafonte, so many musicians, the Staple Singers, one of the great gospel groups, they all lent their voices in concerts, in sit-ins, and when civil rights workers were imprisoned in Parchman Penitentiary and other places, they found strength through singing together. And their music was a way of surviving and enduring hard times, as the music had been for centuries before. Music, as well as photography, are joined at the hip with social justice and protest. So music was always there during the protest movement, and it is intimately associated with it.
Absolutely. I just put a link in the chat for anyone who's interested to a book by local author Kelly Starling Lyons. It's a picture book about Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's an excellent book, and I really recommend it to anybody who's interested. Beautifully illustrated, well written. So highly recommend. Let's see if we have any other questions. We have a question here. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the more accessible technology for documenting events today, in your view? If you could have had a high-definition camera in your pocket when you were doing your earlier work, would it have changed your output?
Well, I tell my students, you have no excuse not to do this kind of work, because in your pocket, your iPhone or whatever you carry will take better digital photographs, record better sound, and do high definition film at no cost. You simply transfer it to a disk drive, and there you have what you need. If I had had what I have today, I'm sure I would have used it to the hilt. I still use this new technology. I carry forward what I do using it to do photographs, sound recordings, and film. But I also go back to that old tried and true camera, both the still and the film, of the grainy black and white images. In many ways, that's the best thing I did. The quality in quotes was not as good as what I did later, but it had the feeling of the heart and the faces and the people within them you identify with in ways that, to me, are probably my best work. There's a sense, when you look at a photograph, it speaks to you about people and places and memory, and the power of the photograph is second to none in terms of capturing these worlds. And in the case of civil rights in the 60s, these are the people that did it so well, and their lives and their photographs will never be forgotten.
Yes, I definitely don't use my camera and audio recorder for enough documentation. Although I did see on Twitter recently about an NPR survey that's going on right now, where they have asked people to send their last photo before the pandemic started and then their first photo after the pandemic started. And I'm sure they're getting really interesting photos from people. There's just such a dramatic, shift in behavior. So it's interesting to sort of look at that as an example of people using their technology to document. Let's see. I have a question here. I would love to hear a few words from Lyneise about her work on archival technologies and erasures. How can we do the work to preserve a more true record going forward?
Oh, thank you for that question. Part of the work I do is to bring attention to the fact that there are technologies that have been used already that have erased huge groups of people from the historical record. Because, I mean, for example, microfilm. Microfilm was used to image newspapers since the 1930s. And in the process of using microfilms, libraries were told to get rid of the physical copy of the newspaper because it would free up space. And plus, newspapers are really difficult to preserve, really difficult. They crumble, the paper's inexpensive. So, but there were certain questions about the microfilm itself that weren't asked, like the fact that it's made to record very dark colors and very light colors and very little in between. So if people of color fall in between that spectrum, they don't get recorded. The subtleties don't get recorded, and a lot of things don't get recorded, which is what you saw in the newspaper, because that's a microfilm copy of, and then a digitized copy on top of a microfilm copy of a newspaper. And in addition to that, in 1914, the Library of Congress started to microfilm in 1929, but the U.S. federal offices were already segregated. Woodrow Wilson had done that in 1914. And in doing so, there was no one at the Library of Congress at that table of power in terms of making the decision. There was nobody to speak up about, what are the implications of this medium, microfilm, on all of the different people who are represented in the newspapers. So that's a part of what the technological component of representation is, a part of what Vera Collaborative addresses. And I am currently a part of a team that is funded by the National Park Services, and we are creating a digital asset management system for the Mary McLeod Bethune archives. And so I've been embedded with computer scientists and engineers to inform and to learn also, but to definitely raise questions about the technology that they are using to convert those analog materials into digital formats that can be used in a digital asset management system. So Vera Collaborative addresses representation writ large, but that component has a huge impact on the way we remember things. I mean, if you go to an archive and you can't see entire populations of people because of uninformed decisions made about how to record that information, you're erasing, you're distorting the history of the country. You're distorting the history that is a part of who we are.
Mm-hmm. All right. It looks like that was the last question, which is perfect. We are just about at 7 o'clock. Before we wrap up, I would love to just give a few quick reminders. If you'd like to purchase a copy of I'm a Man from Flyleaf, you can click the link just below our faces to order online, or you can shop in the store. We're open Monday through Saturday from 11 to 5. We have signed book plates by Bill Ferris, so we will include those with your order. If you've already purchased a copy of the book, but you enjoyed our programming tonight and you'd like to donate a few dollars to the store, we always appreciate that. There's a donate button just below our faces, and that encourages or enables us to continue to offer programming. We really appreciate it. And I want to give a huge thank you to our guests tonight, Dr. Lyneise Williams and Dr. Bill Ferris. And photographer Doris Derby, who attended the event, was in the chat tonight. That was a wonderful surprise. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to everyone else for watching. Please please check out our future events if you liked this one and are interested in joining us for more. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.